Brazil has gone, over the last 4 years, Brazil's had a kind of boom-bust story. I think that's the key theme. Boom-bust because we started off, with the economy growing quite robustly and things doing rather well. And we've ended this 4-year cycle in the exact opposite end of the spectrum. So the economy is not growing at the moment, inflation's high, the fiscal accounts are weak, the external accounts are weak, and thus we now have to put in place a very, very coherent new macroeconomic strategy to kind of try to get things back on track. So I'd say that the main weakness is that we don't have growth at the moment, but the strength is that we do have a clear sense of direction of where things should be going. There's a new economic team in place. There are measures that have been announced to kind of put the economy back on track, and hopefully this will bear fruit sometime down the road. Well, it's essentially a number of fiscal measures to get the fiscal accounts back in order. So in 2014, Brazil posted its first primary deficit as a percent of GDP, in the last 2 decades. This was essentially the first primary deficit in almost 20 years. So we are coming from a very, very weak fiscal position. At the same time, the current account deficit has doubled from 2010. So in 2010, we had a current account surplus of about 2% of GDP. It's now up at 4% of GDP. So things have become unhinged. And these measures that have been announced are measures that aim to, A, boost revenues and thus solidify the fiscal account, and B, reduce expenditures in order to turn a deficit situation around to a surplus situation. So the economic front, there's that message being put forth very clearly. Also, we do have an inflationary problem. Inflation is running at above what it should be. Brazil has an inflation target regime, and the top of the inflation target is 6.5% a year. Inflation is currently running at 7%. So there's a clear effort and some clear messages coming out of the central bank that inflation needs to be brought down. So there's a coherent macroeconomic framework that's being elaborated and put in place. And hopefully, as I said, this will bear fruit at some point. Now, the thing that is important, though, is that all of this is being done at a time when the economy is weak. So that makes, the whole adjustment effort that much harder. But, it's at least a good thing that we have seen a change in the way that the government is tackling these things, and they seem to be very serious about getting the economy back on track. Well, austerity has become kind of a bad word in Brazil in light of what's been happening, all over the world with the backlash on austerity, like we've seen in Greece, like we've seen in other European countries. So the authorities are calling it a consolidation agenda, just to put it more nicely. But yes, in many ways, it is an austerity agenda. I mean, we're talking about things like cutting back on expenditures. Cutting back on expenditures is painful. There are people that you're going to be affecting. To some extent, you may have to touch upon some benefits, perhaps not the benefits like the Bolsa Familia and things like that have helped social inclusion over the last few years. But certainly you'll have to, deal with things that currently are just a huge weight on the budget, and people will feel that pinch. So in that sense, they are measures that, aim at austerity, aim at consolidation, aim at putting the fiscal situation back on track. There's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of pushback, especially on the side. Well, the whole political situation is very much, at the moment, is very much disorganized in a sense, because we have, and we haven't mentioned this, but we have a very large corruption scandal going on with the country's largest company, the oil company Petrobras. So this has put, the entire political system in a kind of crisis mode, which certainly doesn't help things. On the side of the population, what's been happening, at least the reaction to these measures, has been very negative. President Dilma, during the campaign, was saying that she was not going to put in place some of these very painful measures that have actually been put in place now. And, you know, so there's a certain feel of betrayal amongst the population that, you know, things that were said were not going to be done are now actually being done. So the whole environment at the moment is very delicate. It's a very delicate moment for Brazil, but I'm hoping we can come out of this at some point, you know, with the economy more robust and more solid than we've seen it. The water situation, Brazil is currently facing these very dramatic water shortages in certain parts of the country. This is partly the result of climate change, obviously, but it's also the result of lack of planning. And this is lack of planning both at the federal level as well as the state level. So there are some states that are suffering from this more than others. The state of São Paulo, which is a big industrial hub in Brazil, is suffering quite a bit. The water situation bites into the energy situation as well, because Brazil is a country that depends very much on hydroelectric power. Because there are water shortages, the reservoirs are down, and the water shortage plays into electricity rationing. And we've actually seen, I mean, although the government has not announced that rationing is actually taking place, what we have seen already in places like São Paulo and other states in the southeast of the country, which is the region that is most affected by these things, is that we have seen already some rationing going on. So there have been blackouts. There have been, you know, actual rationing measures being put in place even though they haven't been announced. This makes the whole climate all that more uncertain. So it makes people, you know, feel that the situation has really deteriorated to a large extent and has deteriorated much faster than they thought it would back 3 months ago when the whole campaign was still going on and when the whole story or narrative that the government was telling was one where, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. So yes, we have those risks on top of the corruption scandal, on top of the weak macroeconomic situation. So as I said, it's an extremely delicate moment for Brazil. It's a very interesting moment as well, and we have to see how these things will play out. And I think realistically, people should aim at, you know, thinking how the change of direction is going to take place throughout 2015. So I think people should be less focused on some of the numbers that have been put out there by the authorities. So for example, the finance minister has said that he wants a target, his target for the fiscal surplus, for the primary surplus, is 1.2% of GDP. I think people should focus less on the 1.2 and should focus more on the turnaround. So there is a turnaround that's going on. If Brazil manages to turn around a deficit situation, which is what we saw last year, to a surplus situation, which I still think we're likely to see this year, this is a plus. This is a good sign, and this is a sign that things are being put back on track. So I think this is one area where expectations need to become a little bit more realistic. You know, we won't be able to do a lot of the things that perhaps we were aiming to do late last year, simply because the situation is all that much worse and because the obstacles are all that much bigger. But that does not mean that Brazil cannot make some progress this year. So realistically, I think people should expect some progress to be made. It's not going to be, you know, the huge turnaround that perhaps was expected a few months ago, but a turnaround nonetheless. And I think that's where expectations should be set.